Hi, I'm George. I run Yoktu. We're a Klaviyo lead partner and we work with large, complex e-commerce businesses where email is not just a discount delivery mechanism, but also a profit center. And in this video, I want to reframe how you think about A/B testing in Klaviyo and email marketing as a whole, because the truth is, most people think that email CRO is A/B testing subject lines or testing content A and content B within campaigns, which is exactly why dozens of teams run tons of tests and still don't know what's actually driving growth. So here's the promise. By the end of this video, you'll understand what email CRO actually is, what it absolutely is not, and this is the most key thing, how the highest performing growth teams approach testing inside Klaviyo and e-commerce funnels as a whole. Now let's clear something up immediately. CRO is not A/B testing. A/B testing is a tool. CRO instead is a problem-solving system. If you look at the framework on the screen, you'll notice something important. A/B testing shows up very late into the process, and that's intentional. Yet most teams start by asking, what should we test this month? The best growth teams in the world instead start by asking, what problem are we trying to solve for the business? Which means that CRO is about diagnosing what the constraint in that direction is and then creating ideas and tests that will help destroy that constraint. And then you prioritize, of course, by impact. Unless you have this context, this initial business context of this is what matters in the organization, everything that you do is random. Your subject lines or your layouts or your new flows or your timing, all of this needs business context. Unless you have the business context, you're just guessing. And before any test is designed, you need to make sure you collect context from multiple different angles. Now, let me walk you through the core pillars of doing so. Number one, you need to understand the business you're in. This sounds obvious, it's not. You need clarity on what the category looks like, what the competitive landscape looks like, how people are being sold by other companies in your space, which basically means that you need to start with doing competitor research. You need to find what the competition is, look at their ads, look at their funnels, look at their emails. You need to understand what expectations customers bring with them before they open any of your emails. Number two, you want to map the customer journey. At the minimum, you should think in terms of new subscriber journey, new customer journey, new subscription customer journey if you have subscriptions. Each of these people is having a different thought. They're trying to solve a different problem. For example, a new subscriber is asking, is this brand and product worth my time? A new customer is asking, did I make the right decision? And the new subscriber customer is asking, is this going to work long term or is this worth long term? Obviously, the way you should communicate should be completely different dependent on the segment that people are in and where they are in the customer journey. Number three, you want to do user research. This is your qualitative research, as people call it. And fundamentally, you want to understand what confuses people, what objections they have towards purchasing, and what repeat customers and what are the overall outcomes that your audience is looking for. And of course, you want to ideally get the words they use to describe all of those things, right? So how do you do this? The best way to do this is to obviously talk to your customers. You can do surveys, you can actually talk to them, inviting them to a call. And of course, many people neglect this, your customer support logs. They are usually a gold mine of insights that's typically flying under the radar of most marketing teams. Fourth, you need quantitative. You have to look at the data. And the problem with looking at the data is everyone has a lot of data, right? There's a lot of dashboards, a lot of different tools. And if you just start looking at the data, you won't really do anything. You're just going to spend hours and hours looking at dashboards and crunching numbers on your spreadsheet without actually making any progress. What you should do instead is identify what are the levers that your business has, because every business has very few levers that actually matter in its growth model. For example, new lead conversion, very important lever. If you improve this, you will acquire way more customers. Subscription take rate, how many people start a subscription, hugely important. If you increase this number, the company will increase the LTV tremendously. Checkout order AOV, how much people spend on the first order, hugely important. The more this number goes up, the more quickly you get paid, the more you can fund acquisition, the more you can scale. Recurring order AOV, churn rate, etc. There's a lot of levers. Your job really is to understand which of these levers I should be focusing on. And in many cases, your manager or director will give this to you. But if your job is to scale a brand on your own, you need to figure this out on your own. In other words, you need to figure out which of those levers will have the greatest and biggest impact for the business. You look for the bottleneck, right? You ask where rather are we losing the most value right now, and what is slowing growth the most, and what if improved would have the biggest downstream impact for the business. And then of course, once you do this, you're gonna set concrete targets for these KPIs and go all in on improving them. That's how you should be doing your testing, not by just testing things on the campaigns. Now, once you've done the hard work of gathering context, the next step is to turn all of this insight into actual testable ideas. And this is again where most teams fall apart, because the ideas are on Slack threads, they're in people's heads, they are in random Notion pages, or basically they're just forgotten after your meeting. And let me be very clear, that tool doesn't really matter. It can be Airtable, it can be Google Sheets, it can be Notion, it can be ClickUp, it can be Asana. I don't really care. What matters is that the ideas that you have are documented clearly and consistently. So you can always have an inventory of ideas that you can prioritize and execute against. And how an idea should be framed should follow a very simple structure. If we do this, we expect that will happen because of this reason. No exceptions. For example, if we go from having 2-day delays in our welcome flow to sending 3 emails within the first 24 hours, we expect a greater number of conversions because 95 of prospects convert within the first 24 hours. An idea without a reason behind it is just a guess. An idea, of course, can be backed by a lot of things. That can include analysis, can be survey responses, it can be your customer support insights, can be best practices that you know, competitor research, a previous test, or generally just the goals of the business. If the business wants to improve churn rate, then you have to come up with ways to improve churn rate. Not every idea needs perfect data. Not every idea needs this super duper rationale, but you need to have some sort of reason behind it, because this forces discipline. It also makes it easier to interpret later, which is a very big thing that we'll get on later on. Once you start building your idea inventory, something important starts happening. You stop coming up with tests that are just there for you to say that you're testing something. Instead, you're building a backlog of hypotheses on how your customers think and how your business can best help them achieve what they want, and ultimately in so doing make more money. And that's where prioritization is super important. To prioritize ideas, we use a simple framework which is called ICE. Stands for impact, confidence, and ease. Impact is largely driven by how many people the change will affect, right? In email CRO, this often means how many impressions does this get? Is this on a core flow? Is this on a pop-up? Is this on a high volume campaign? Is this early into the life cycle? Basically, changing post-purchase email that reaches 100% of customers will always matter more than tweaking a low volume campaign that doesn't. Confidence is how likely you think the idea is to work. And of course, this is based on data, past experiments, user research, basically how justifiable the idea is. And of course, high confidence ideas don't guarantee success, but for the most part, they help reduce wasted effort. Now, ease is simply how easy or hard is this to implement. Design work, development, support, complexity of the copy and the messaging. Obviously, you want to start with low effort, high impact ideas. That's where you can have the quickest and best impact for the business. So concretely, you should have your testable ideas listed, and then you should score them on impact, confidence, and ease. And then you should prioritize the ideas with high impact, high confidence, and low effort comparative to the others. And what this does is that this removes emotion from decision making, right? It helps you focus on what's most likely to move the needle. Now, let's talk about setting up tests. In my perspective, and this is going to sound theoretical, you should mostly never be testing on the email campaign level. And here's why. Every campaign is different. There's a different audience, different day of the month, different time of the day, different people within the segments, different intent consequently. And then on top of this, you have different design and different copy. So even if test concept A beats concept B in one campaign, it's next to impossible to know whether that result would carry over to the next one, right? And then will that effect carry over if other variables change? For instance, to give an example, if your first campaign test that's a product-based image outperforms a lifestyle-based image, will this always be true? Should you never have lifestyle images in your campaigns? You don't really know. You can't really know. So what do? You will not be able to really learn something or get better from that test. So it can be useful occasionally, particularly if you want to see quickly at a decently high volume what would resonate the most. But the issue is that then it's hard to generalize. Having said this, this is how you set up a campaign test on Klaviyo. To create a campaign A/B test, the first thing you need to do is head over to campaigns, and then you need to press on create campaign to the top right. You will possibly only be testing email for this example, so you can name your campaign like whatever makes sense for your use case, and then you would just press continue. You would select a list to send this to. So far, it's just like you schedule to any other campaign, and then you press next. You are now called to select the content. I will select this template. And then what I'll see is the actual content of the email. This is for one of our clients. Humble bragging about our nice design. And then when you click next, you'll see this section that says create A/B test, which is what you should be pressing. Now, you first need to include the subject line. So let's call this YouTube test, and then we will create A/B test. And you have two main options. Option one is to test content. Option two is to test send time. You can actually test send time and content, but I would not recommend this. So let's suppose that we are testing content. What you'll see is that there's variation A listed here and variation B, which essentially means what? Klaviyo generates an exact copy of the original email, which you can then edit separately. You can change the subject line to be new, and then you can have another subject line here. And similarly, you can actually open the content, edit it separately, have a new hero image, a new button. Obviously, you don't want to be changing too many things at a time. Unless you are specific with what you're changing, then you won't know what caused the change in the performance, if there is a change in the performance. So the rule of thumb is that you want to be changing one variable at a time, which is why you don't want to be changing send time and content at the same time in the first place. But below, you'll find the test settings. You can select a metric that the test will measure its lift on. It can be the open rate, it can be the click rate, the placed order rate. That last one is relatively recent, which is great. You used to only be able to test open rates and click rates. Problem, however, with testing placed order rates is that you will need hundreds of orders for your test is actually significant, statistically significant in most cases, which kind of defeats the purpose of doing this in campaigns. It's more about the flows in our perspective. But let's suppose that we're testing open rates just for simplicity. You then have the option of splitting the traffic between those two variations. And again, the idea is that variation is a copy of variation A, which you can edit separately and customize per your test's requirements. But you can include everybody within the test. So that would be 100, or you can include a portion of people within the test, in which case half the traffic will go to the test, and then the rest of the traffic will go to the better performing version, which assuming the test was significant from a statistics standpoint, will result in better performance. And then of course you can have the test run for a duration of time, which you can customize by hours and days and so on. I've already said so, is to not run campaign tests in the first place. If you were to run a campaign test, my recommendation would be to go all in on the test, because unless you do this, it's extremely unlikely you will have statistical significance, and you will be basically wasting your time creating new versions of content that don't really lead to any sort of learning. Now, what's significantly more powerful than testing within campaigns is experimenting inside flows. And the reason for that is that in flows, every recipient receives the same content in the same order under the same conditions, which over time means what? If you create a lift in the flow, that lift will actually compound. Concretely, a better welcome email will help every new subscriber perform better. A better post-purchase message will improve the experience of every new customer. And that's where email CRO becomes super valuable. I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm going to show you how to create an A/B test within flows. Now, let's talk about setting up flow A/B tests, which is what most of you should be doing. And imagine that this is a flow automation within your account. What most of you would do is click on email one and then head over to create an A/B test by clicking on this native functionality that Klaviyo has, which would lead you to a screen that's fairly similar to how you set up campaign A/B tests. Don't do this. What you should do instead is the following. You should add a conditional split at the top of the flow, and then you should go and select a random sample as the split condition, which in most cases, you're going to be splitting by 50 and 50. Now, what you would do next is that you would duplicate your flow emails, and let's assume that you want to have this exact setup here, wherein we have the different emails and there's a 2-day delay in between the emails. You would go and you would do this, and then you would basically use naming conventions, meaning the email name at the very top, to differentiate what is what. So, for example, here you would have email 1 control, and here you would have email 1 variation, and if only this saved, so this would say control, and then here you would have email 2 control and email 3 control, and on and on and on. And the reason why you want to do this is because you will then use those naming conventions to filter through the data as you are reporting. And the rest is very simple. You would go over here, you would potentially change the subject line or the template or the CTA, the landing page, whatever it is that you would be testing, you would have the ability to test the variations separately. Now, a very common mistake is that the naming convention is hard to understand later on. The way Klaviyo reports is based on the flow name. So you can filter by flow name. And then you can filter by message, which in this case would be email 1, email 2, email 3, or you could just filter by control so that it would list everything together. I'm going to show you how to do the reporting later on. But basically, unless the name of the email makes sense to you, and it's important it makes sense to you, not necessarily to me, it will be hard to analyze the results later on. Another common issue is that if you set up a test in a flow, and this can happen whether you set it up this way or any other way, such as by using the create A/B test functionality here, it's possible that email 1 of path A, say the control version, outperforms email 1 of path B, the variation or challenger, but then the other emails underperform. And what I mean by that is that you should always be measuring not just email 1 versus email 1, but how does this test on email 1 affect the performance of future emails. You might have a very misleading offer on email 1, which will convert slightly more users, hence email 1 will outperform the control, but then there's 90 people that get annoyed by this that you don't really notice, and then they buy less from the subsequent emails. So you have to be very, very careful with what you're testing. Now, one caveat here. To actually run tests, you need a lot of data, and people don't really realize this. So I'm going to show you this tool that we've developed internally. It's a minimum detectable effect calculator. There's plenty like this. If you search online, you're going to find your own. But essentially what it does is it shows you how much time in terms of weeks, and then how many visitors and how many conversions you would need per variant to detect a conversion lift of this percentage. So let's assume that we're getting 500 clicks, which stands for traffic in the email context, per week on our email 1, which really means that we get 250 per variant, right? Because it gets paid 50-50. And then imagine that 25% of those people buy. It would actually take more than 12 weeks for us to conclude the test. You're always going to be expecting a 20% lift. And this is actually a large lift, right? Depending on the actual lift, you may need less or more time, obviously, but before you set up a test, you should have like a baseline that, okay, I expect to get, say, 20% lift if this works. So you always want to have your 20% lift be detectable within at most 12 weeks. Otherwise, it's going to take too long for the test to matter. So if we had 50 conversions, we would be able to detect 21% lift by week 12, which is going to essentially mean that we need 300 conversions per variation for this to actually conclude, which is a lot of traffic, by the way. I don't know if you realize this. The reason why I'm showing you this is to show you that to let tests be statistically significant takes time or traffic. In many cases, both. So point of which is that you don't want to have too many splits within the flows. Now, big brands have a lot of splits. We work with many of them. They have very complex flows. But if you're watching this and you want to get an easy rule of thumb, try to keep the flow logic as simple as it gets so that you don't dilute the traffic too much, because for you to be statistically significant, you will need insane traffic if you have a lot of flow paths. Now, let's imagine that you've let your test run and you've seen that the variation here outperforms the control version. How do you conclude the test? You would simply go over here and set this at 0%, which means that everybody would go to the no path. Hence, you would have variation be the version that receives the traffic. And similarly, if the control version outperformed, you would need to do the opposite, set the traffic to 100% so that everybody receives the full traffic. Now, how should you run a new A/B test, assuming that you have this setup? What you should actually do to get the cleanest possible data is do this. You should have your current or old rather version is set up here, and then you should basically have your new test set up like this. I know it looks complex, but it's important that you're getting clean data. So you would add your emails in this new variation here, and let's say that this is called new, and then you would have also variation, or better yet, just have the date instead of new so that you know what test is launched when, or another description that again would make sense for you. The naming convention matters because that's how you filter through the reports and create your analysis. It's important that it makes sense for you, not that it makes sense for me. All you need is a way to differentiate between the previous test and a way to view the results separately in a clean way. Now, let's assume that I've set up the rest of the flow paths down below just for simplicity. Once you are ready to set up the new test live, all you would need to do is take this to 100%. And the reason why you want to do this is so that this keeps sending when it is supposed to send, and that you start adding traffic to both paths from the same moment so that they both get equal traffic. Unless you do this, you will have one version having more traffic than the other, and the subsequent emails will have more recipients than the previous ones, and so on. So the way I showed you is the cleanest possible way to set up an A/B test. And of course, assuming you are documenting the results of your testing properly, and you have screenshots of your control and a screenshot of your variation, you could just go ahead and even delete some of the old tests that you're launching just to keep it less cluttered. Now let's talk about reporting. You've run your test. What do you do next? It's time to actually report on the results of the test. So I'm going to show you what you do next. What you have to do is go over to analytics, then click on custom reports, select the flow performance report. You can name the report in a way that makes sense to you, such as Yocto flow test analysis in this case, and probably you should analyze email and SMS separately. So in this case, you have different metrics than you do in this case, just so that it's like easier and cleaner for you to review. You should at the baseline measure opens, clicks, unsubscribes, bounce rates, spam complaints, etc. In this case, we're just having the main engagement metrics plus the revenue metrics. Concretely, this first one gives you the number of orders. This gives you the purchased order rate, how many, like as a percentage, how many people purchase out of 100, and then the actual dollar value of all of the sales. You can next group by flow message, including variations, or by flow message without variations, dependent on whether you have variations within the emails themselves. This may or may not be required. The rest of the workflow is totally the same. So these are the options you have: flow message, and you would simply be clicking here if you want to have the variations within the email itself, which again, in most cases is not necessary. So think that you want to do this, then you want to set a custom time frame, which basically does what? It includes data from the date you launched your test all the way to today. And how long should you run the test? Again, you need to do the pre-testing calculation that I showed you to figure out that, okay, it's going to take me approximately 12 weeks to detect a 20% lift. So you should set a reminder to check after 12 weeks if that were the case. And this is what the data looks like. You have the date, the flow ID, which doesn't really matter. Then you have the flow name, the flow message name, and then you will even have the variations, if any, which in this case, those first few ones don't. But basically, as long as you have this, you can then export this into a CSV. The CSV, once imported and opened through Google Sheets, will look a little bit like this. All you need to do is apply filters by pressing the button up here. You simply select the first line and then you apply filters like this. And then you can filter by flow. You can filter, for example, let's say I only want to see those emails. I have the flow and then the messages within the flow. And then I have the numbers that I set to basically pull. And in this case, it has a lot of recipients, relatively high open rates, which you can add into percentages so that they're easier to understand and read than the decimals. And then what you would do next is take this data and paste it over into an analysis sheet, which could look something like this. This is the one we use within our own agency clients, wherein we have our control. We add the emails of the control. We can see that they had barely had any sales, around 5 sales. And then we have the challenger version. In this case, we had 37 sales, significantly sales, like more clicks also, more everything, frankly. And then there's like a summary of what's the relative increase in revenue, relative increase in conversions, and then there's like the actual delta or absolute difference between the two. And obviously you can do this in a separate way, but in my view, this is a very clean way to communicate results. Clients understand it, it's clear for our team, it's easy to understand what is going on. So how you analyze reports. You create a report on Klaviyo, import on CSV, and then you calculate the difference between control and variation, or variation A, variation B, or control and challenger, depending on what language you use to describe your testing. And believe it or not, if you've watched all the way till the end, you've learned the fundamentals of running a CRO program within Klaviyo and hopefully beyond. Now, if you are serious about building a real CRO system inside Klaviyo instead of experimenting randomly, that's exactly the type of work we do at Yocto. There's a link to book a call with me down below. And if this video was useful in any way, please subscribe. It helps more than you think. This channel will get big over time. You're here early. Please share it with people that can benefit from it. And I'm gonna see you in the next video.